Hello, sweet creatures. I'm Claire. I'm Galaxy Coop all over the internet, and today I want to give you some helpful steps for creating mixed media pieces, backgrounds. What I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be making these little mixed media cards with a little bit of collaging, but I'm mostly going to be going over how I approach mixed media so that it's fun. Having some steps so that it's not overwhelming, because with mixed media it can feel like there's so many options. There's oil pastels and acrylic paints and watercolor paints and chalk pastels, and how do I choose what to layer? How do I choose what to layer? And sometimes you'll layer things and you'll realize they don't want to work together, and that's super frustrating. So I'm just gonna give you a few helpful tips and tricks to get you through that little process, through those little issues. And we're just making some cards today that are simple. There's no real magical intention. I'm just throwing these together, and I'll use these for my grimoire. Eventually I'll find a purpose for them, or I will make cards like these to send in the mail to friends and family, or snail mail buddies, witchcraft mail buddies. They always seem to find a purpose. So that's the intention. I hope you'll stick around and have some fun playing with some mixed media with me. Okay, so here are some very general rules of thumb for creating mixed media layers that don't skip or interrupt other layers. I'm going to talk about exceptions after this, but this is how I layer my paints and all of my different mixed media materials when I'm making a background, so that it doesn't fall apart or not want to layer on each other. And you can look at this two ways. You can look at it as water and oil, or you can look at it as thin to thick. The thinner layers go first and the thicker layers. I like to think of it as water to oil. So your first layer is going to be watercolor. Watercolor pencils fall in this layer, watercolor paints, and then you move into inks. Now, inks and watercolor, you can kind of do these at the same time. Same with gouache, but your gouache, if you watercolor over top the gouache, it may pick up the gouache. So you want to move from the thinnest type of watercolor to the thickest. So along with the watercolor are inks. So India inks, alcohol inks, watercolor inks, acrylic inks around the same time as the watercolor, and you can create some really cool effects by mixing the alcohol and the watercolor. And this is when I would do stamping as well. Acrylic paint, it's thicker, it goes over top the water. Sometimes there's exceptions to every rule. You can paint watercolor over acrylic paint, and a lot of people do acrylic paint very first. Not dissing on them, this is just how I do things. I find that the watercolor does not always like to interact with the acrylic paint, but if that's what you're going for, super. And then we move into oily things. So we've got our crayons. Crayons are going to layer well over top of the watercolors. They might not layer well over top of the gouache, but that just depends. And these are just standard wax Crayola crayons. And then you move into colored pencils. Colored pencils don't always layer over your crayons or your wax pastels, but this is a general thin to thick situation. And then you have your oil pastels. Those are going to be able to layer over pretty much everything. And then there's also water-based oil pastels, gel crayons, gel pastels. Faber-Castell calls them gelatos. They can layer over pretty much everything too. So yes, start with your thin, watery things and then move into your oily things. And now we're going to talk about exceptions to the rules. The first exception to the rules is if you want to use a wax resist in your background. We're not going to be doing that today. But if I was going to wax resist my watercolor paints, I want to do acrylic, my crayons, and then my watercolor paints. effects, and that'll create a beautiful wax resist. I've done this a lot on my TikTok if you go back and watch my old videos on there, and I'll probably do it here in the future if you're interested. Exception number 2, obviously acrylic paint can go over pretty much everything. And that includes like acrylic paint pens, your Poscas, your acrylographs, your Art X acrylic paint pens, whatever acrylic paint pens you have will go over pretty much everything if you're taking good care of them. They might not like the gel crayons, gel pastels, and they might not like going over the oil pastels. It really depends on their consistency. And then exception number 3 are water-soluble mediums. So these gel crayons, gelatos, those are water-soluble. So if you use them with water in your watercolor layer, you're gonna use them in that layer. Same with a water-soluble oil pastel. It can be used both ways. It can be used with my water on my water layer and get some really beautiful, juicy effects. And it can also function like a normal oil pastel on top of all of my layers to create some effects. And then finally, it's the water-soluble wax pastels. Water-soluble wax pastels. So these are your Caran d'Ache wax pastels. They're like super nice fancy crayons. If I'm using them again with my water mediums and watering them down, I'm going to keep them down here. If I'm using them more like crayons, I'm going to use them in the same layer that I would like a wax crayon, a Crayola crayon. Again, they don't like to layer over the oil pastels, the gelatos, the thicker mediums, but they will layer over the colored pencil, the acrylics, watercolor, etc. All this long-winded explanation will make a whole lot more sense when I dig out a piece of paper and we just start making a background. Alright, I'm going in with watercolor. I'm going wet and wet. This is really juicy and wet because I want things to spread around. I'm going to spritz it with a homemade alcohol ink that I made with India ink and just isopropyl alcohol. It creates such lovely textures. I'm spattering more watercolor on top, and then I'm going in with a watercolor pencil into the wet paint to really change that effect. I'm taking that same India ink and I'm dabbing it on, adding water on top to create these spidery blobs. I love this effect. I've used it in a class to create a sunflower field, and it was so much fun. And then I'm going to go over with another layer of watercolor to get my colors even more saturated and to create some interest. It's interesting this way. Again with the watercolor pencil, and then we're going to let this dry, or make it dry. We're making it dry because I'm a little impatient. But I'm going to do a second one, and for this one I'm going to use a couple different techniques. Just a couple. This one's going to be blue, but we're starting the same way with our thinnest, wateriest thing, the watercolor paints. A lot of these paints are more granulating. The size of the pigment in the paint is much larger, so it creates interesting effects on its own. Spattering it again, dabbing it away with a tissue, adding watercolor ink. This is really granulating watercolor ink. It looks way more vibrant on the camera than it does in person. I'm not sure what the deal with that is, but it's a little softer in person. And just getting this dry, and because I dabbed away areas, I'm gonna have some harsh lines in here, but I think that creates some interesting shapes. And then I'm gonna go in with colored pencil, moving into my waxier, oilier mediums, and then also crayon. And then I'm gonna do a little mini wax resist, not the whole paper, just in little spots, just for fun, because I thought it would look interesting, and it did, and it was fun. And that's all that matters. And that's the process. That's it. It's really that simple. So we have our two different papers. One of them I went by my rules, going through water-based mediums and some alcohol mediums to create some interesting effects. And then on the second one, I broke the rules just a little bit by going in with some crayon to create some resists and some little baubles that may resist the acrylic paint when we get into that. Before acrylic paint, do we want to just use brushes, or do we want to use household objects, random items? I do have an interesting mark making tool to show you with the watercolor paint before we get into that. So I took a strip of some really nice quality absorbent watercolor paper and I spiraled it up and hot glued it to this cork. So when I get a big, beautiful, juicy puddle of watercolor paint, because the paper is a good quality watercolor paper, it absorbs the paint just a little bit, just enough that I can use this as a stamp for watercolor paint, which means I can use any color I want. But I just thought this was such a fun shape, and you get some interesting like skips in it, obviously like the variability of the color. So I thought this was a cool tool, and I've been using it for a while now and it hasn't gotten messed up. But like, this watercolor strip was a piece of trash and so was this cork. So we're going to be getting into some acrylic mark making similarly with trash. You could spread acrylic paint onto a stamp and use that, just clean it off very well. You can use an old card of some kind to scrape paint. You can do this, the scraping paint before all your layers can create some interesting effects. Bubble wrap, pipe cleaners, old fabric bunched up. So I'm gonna grab a couple objects and just add some acrylic paint on here. Both of these probably just in white for these, since they are just backgrounds. These aren't going to be finished abstract mixed media pieces. I'm going to cut these apart and turn them into cards like we said at the start of the video. So let's see what sort of objects I can find. For my mark making, I'm just going to use some packaging today. I've got cardboard that I've stripped off a layer on. I've got a different type of cardboard, this honeycomb cardboard that I've stripped a layer off of. I've got some styrofoam and a little chunk of bubble wrap and a paintbrush. And we are just going to paint on. I added some green paint as well because I thought it'd be fun. Paint onto our bubble wrap or our cardboard and use it like a stamp pretty much. And that's all. We're just going to be making marks just like we did before, repeating things at least 3 times across the composition if you're making one singular piece, repeating a bunch of times across the composition if this is going to be cut apart, which I think is so cool to see all the how different each section is when you cut apart a piece like this that you've worked in one whole part, and then see how it changes when it's divided. I'm being kind of light-handed with my bubble wrap. You could go super heavy-handed. You'll get some crazy outlines from the paint seeping in between the cracks on your bubble wrap. There's really a ton of possibilities, but we will swap over to a time lapse for the remaining portion of this portion. So I'm actually really happy with how these papers look right now. So I'm gonna cut them into quarters, probably cut off some of the edges, and then when I work in some layers on top of them for the final cards, I'm going to use the wax pastels, the oil pastels, the colored pencils, all of my thicker, oilier mediums for decorating amongst the collaged images. And we will time-lapse that. But I hope this gave you some insight into some mixed media techniques. I'm going to talk more about how I'm layering images together. Mostly it's just vibes. Just have fun. Just play with it. But we'll get into a little time lapse in just a moment. Okay, so I've cut three pieces out of my pieces of paper, and I have some scraps here off to the side. I'm gonna pick out some stuff to collage onto the paper with, and we're gonna mix in the oil pastels and wax pastels while we're collaging. So I have like stickers, really thin stickers. You can use any stickers, and I also have ephemera that I've made, stamped ephemera on bits of paper. I have die cuts, and since I'm not working to a specific intention, I'm not making art magic specifically right now. I am just making fun little pieces that I can mail to people, or that I can put in my grimoire or add more to in the future. So that is why I'm just picking assorted things. I'm also not going to go any bigger than 5x7 for these cards, because I know that's a good size to mail. Anything bigger than that's going to be much more difficult to mail. So these are 5x7, and I think these are 4x5 or 4.5x5. Just so I have a couple different sizes. Now these scraps, they won't go to waste. Everyone knows here, they don't go to waste. So I'm going to introduce you to my binder. This is a binder, color coded, full of all of my scrap material, and I'm also going to pull from here some stuff to collage on to my papers, just to add a little extra interest and texture. And then all of these little bitty scrap pieces are also going to go into this. So if you're a mixed media magic maker like I am, and you have all these itty bitty scraps and you don't know what to do with in the moment, but you know that they're going to be useful, might I recommend scrap binder. I don't recommend giving it to your cat to chew on. But this has been incredibly useful for me, and I need to use some stuff on it because it is a little bulky. So I'm going to select some stuff from here. We're going to go to a time lapse. I'm just going to collage and layer on my oily layers, and that's going to be about it. We'll go straight from the time lapse into some sexy final shots and thoughts, and I hope you'll stick around. I forgot to turn my camera on for the time lapse, so we're going to go through it on this other piece of paper. I have a ton of painted papers that are just excess paint from when I'm doing something else. I'll just slap it on there, or when I feel like just making a mixed media background because it's fun. I will do that. So I have this with scraped acrylic paint and some ink, and we're just gonna go through and do the same collaging method that I did for the rest of them, and then you'll see the rest at the end. And I'm just going to use the stuff I picked out for the other ones. I'm not sure if I'll use that moon. But just moving things around. Sometimes I'll have an idea based on how something already looks, on how I want it to look. Yeah, okay. Something like this. And I talked about, when I was making the designs, rules of threes. So rules of threes, how can we get 3 elements on here? Oh, how about that? That way we have some matching gold elements. Maybe we'll... Is that weird? It's a little weird. So we're just gonna play with all the stuff we have picked out. And I like just pre-picking things out because otherwise I'll just have too much stuff to choose from. And then I won't ever decide how I'm gonna place things. Okay, like that. And then once I have things placed, I'll go in with my waxy mediums or acrylic paint or glitter watercolors made very thick. I promise you there will be a glitter watercolor video soon. Just placing things that will actually show up on top of this material. And that's why I like to go in with the waxy mediums, because there's a variety of papers and surfaces. These two papers are already covered in watercolor paint. This book page here with the stamp, that was stamped with acrylic paint, so watercolor is probably not going to show up on top of it, and neither would an ink. So acrylic paint, waxy mediums, going to the thickest one last, so our oil pastels very last will work the best. And for this one, I kind of want to go a little bit more abstract, and I'm just gonna make some more stars. And that includes with my colored pencils. If I try to do colored pencil on top of this oil pastel, you can see it kind of just lifts up the oil pastel. This will also happen with acrylic markers, and it'll gunk up your marker. So be careful with these super wet, and same thing with the gel sticks. If I were to use the gel stick on here, I would gunk up my pencil or my acrylic marker. So just be careful, and that's why we do our watery and our less thick, less waxy, oily mediums first. Because they'll gunk each other up and they won't play nice. Some of the wax pastels, different pigments will have different consistencies. You'll see that in watercolor, you'll see that in oil paint, you'll see that in wax pastels. So some of the wax pastels will play with the crayons, some won't. The fun part is you get to find out through experimentation. You get to discover these things about your materials, and you can discover things about all sorts of materials. They don't have to be expensive or fancy to be interesting. And I'm gonna call this one done, and I'm gonna show you the final shots of all of the ones I completed. I'm so sorry that I forgot to press the filming button. But you'll get to see the final results, and I'll talk through some of the choices I made. So we have this one we made just now. And then we have this firefly one. So I have the two collaged bits, and I worked on top. This is all wax pastel, and it dries down pretty nicely, pretty firmly. It's not going to move around much. And then some oil pastel to give him his little glowing rump. And you'll see here I have 3 of each of my colors in these leaves and 3 of the plant shapes. So I'm repeating in 3s. This again, I'm repeating in threes. I have 3 stamped elements, and then I went in with the water-soluble oil pastel to create my trail of paint coming out of this paint tube, and I also went over it a little bit with water to blend it out a bit. The reason I used the oil pastel was because it would layer over all these different papers very well. And then I also did some crayon on this one. Rule of threes yet again. I have 3 repeated stamped elements and they're all blue. Because there was no other blue in this piece, I needed to repeat it and make sure it was repeated 3 times across the piece. I also have a couple collaged pieces of book paper just for some extra interest, and then I have 3 pink flowers for the bee to visit, and I repeated my blue again, just accenting the leaves with this green, and this is all wax pastels. And then I did some stars with the colored pencil, and I liked that the moon was caught in a spider web. This one I repeated elements 5 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I repeated some stamped elements 3 times. And I repeated some colored pencil elements 3 times. And then I also went in with some oil pastel. I have this paper I pulled from the scrap paper binder for the edge. And yeah, I'm just using rules of threes to create interesting compositions. This one, there's still 3 elements. Can you count them? 1 moon and 2 types of leaves. And each leaf, there's 3 of. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. And there's 3 stars. There's 6 stars. 3 in 2 different colors. And this is the oil pastels and the wax pastels. And the last one, this is done with stickers, so you don't need your own handmade stuff or stuff from Etsy. You can just use normal stickers. These stickers have some really not great adhesive, so I do have to glue them down. But all I did was I fussy cut around the stickers, so I had less of the background color, but the background color is pretty similar to my paper color, so I'm not super worried about that. And then I glued them down. I added butterfly wings to the whales, and I did clouds in the wax pastels. Some cotton candy clouds for our fairy whales. So to go over our mixed media process again, we're starting with thin, watery medium. So that's our watercolor pencils, acrylics, inks, stamps, ink pads, and then we go in with our thicker, oilier substances. So that's colored pencils, crayons, oil pastels, wax pastels, with some exceptions to the rules. So exception to the rule here, I went over these oil pastels with an acrylic marker. Again, it does gunk up your markers, so be careful, or just clean your marker between. Other exceptions, if you want to do a wax resist, we had a wax resist on the blue paper. Do your wax before your water-based medium, and then some mediums are water and oil based, so our water-soluble wax pastels are water-soluble oil pastels, but you can use that to your advantage. Most important part is to have fun, and I feel like knowing the steps, water to oil, thin to thick, helps you not get frustrated when you can't get the watercolor to layer over top the oil pastels the way you want it to, or you can't get your acrylic marker to go through thick oil pastels, it refuses to go over. It relieves some of that, and it'll relieve some of your hesitance when making fun little backgrounds or just like a mixed media abstract art piece, knowing like, oh, how do I start? I can start with watercolor and I know I'll be able to layer everything else over top. So I hope this helps you or was at least a little bit fun to watch. I have to go feed my cats. I'm Claire, or Galaxy Coop, all over the internet, and I hope to see you here again soon. Goodbye!